Throughout the world, chattel slavery, the form of slavery where people are treated as permanent property, has existed for a long time. In chattel slavery, people were treated as a commodity and were frequently captured and sold along with other goods. Chattel slavery did not begin in America. However, it is during the period of the transatlantic slave trade within American plantations that chattel slavery, the practice of permanent familial slavery, took on one of its most cruel and dehumanizing forms. Millions of people had their possessions, homes, and families forcefully taken away from them as if they were livestock. Fear of slave uprisings and the disparagement of African culture facilitated physical and emotional abuse for the duration of the Confederate South. This rhetoric and mistreatment would persist after the Civil War. The lack of rights and consequentially the loss of responsibilities of enslaved people from abuse under chattel slavery was a gross violation of basic moral standards that was justified by the demonization of African Americans and baseless moral superiority.
This documentary will consider the practice of chattel slavery within the 13 colonies, now the United States, during the period of the transatlantic slave trade. Chattel slavery is known to have been used in Mesopotamia in 3000 BCE and before, and it is also referenced in their Code of Hammurabi from 1750 BCE, but it began in the colonies in 1620. The first European settlers arrived in the U.S. at the beginning of the 17th century, settling Jamestown as one of the first cities in the colonies. The first people who were enslaved were brought from Africa in 1620, and slavery soon became the standard means of production for luxury goods, especially in southern colonies. There, massive amounts of sugar and tobacco were grown under forced labor, as these cash crops were high in demand and extremely profitable. Chattel slavery on mass plantations soon became a key part of the economy in spite of the economic, civil, social, or human rights of enslaved people.
The practice of slavery grew, and in 1641, the first colony to consider slavery as a legal institution was Massachusetts, with the remaining colonies following suit by 1662. Enslaved people had a multitude of responsibilities assigned to them by their owners and became an afterthought for many of them as they were systematically dehumanized. One of the only options to combat these conditions was to revolt, and revolts began to consistently happen as chattel slavery became established in the Americas. In 1676, Bacon's rebellion in Virginia caused the government to increase the scale at which they enslaved people, and in the early 18th century, a revolt in New York City led to increased legal restrictions on people who were enslaved. Slave owners seemed keen on avoiding the social and ethical responsibilities of their rights. This large-scale mistreatment of people required many moral justifications. Many people viewed chattel slavery as a justified means to enlighten so-called savages and barbarians to Christian doctrine, English language, and European and/or American ideals. Most certainly of all, people in power residing in southern states used their power to impose restrictions on what little rights the enslaved people had.
The Virginia State Act of 1705 stated that, quote, "And if any slave resists his master or owner or other person by his or her order, correcting such slave, and shall happen to be killed in such correction, it shall not be accounted felony, but the master, owner, and every such other person so giving correction shall be free and acquit of all punishment and accusation for the same. That the baptism of slaves does not exempt them from bondage, and that all children shall be bond or free, according to the condition of their mothers and the particular directions of this act." End quote. From these laws, a slave owner might beat an enslaved person to a pulp in order to set an example for not meeting difficult quotas, or threaten to separate a family in order to encourage productivity. In this, an enslaved person loses civil and human rights as they face cruel and unusual punishment and have lost their freedom of expression. Slave owners disregarded the responsibilities of their rights to restrict the rights of their subjects by viewing them as less than human by nature.
However tightly the chattel slave owners tried to justify their ownership over other people, such justification certainly did not convince the people who toiled and suffered endlessly under brutal conditions. From the perspective of people who had all their rights taken away from them, slavery was unanimously horrible. They hated slavery for taking away their economic, social, civil, and human rights in the favor for economic profits. In a book written by Olado Ekwano about his experiences as a slave, he says, quote, "When I looked around the ship too, and saw a large furnace or copper boiling, and a multitude of black people of every description chained together, every one of their countenances expressing dejection and sorrow, I no longer doubted of my fate, and quite overpowered with horror and anguish, I fell motionless on the deck and fainted. When I recovered a little, I found some black people about me. I asked them if we were not to be eaten by those white men with horrible looks, red faces, and loose hair," unquote. Enslaved people were horrified not only by the fact that they were going to be enslaved, but also by those who would slave them. Depression and fear were common.
Slavery continued as the norm for many years. In 1777, one of the first legal documents was filed by enslaved people calling for their release, with these people in Massachusetts saying, "The petition of a great number of blacks, detained in a state of slavery in the bowels of a free and Christian country, humbly showeth that your petitioners apprehend that they have in common with all other men a natural and inalienable right to that freedom which the great parent of a neighbors hath bestowed equally on all mankind." Appealing to religion and the goodness of the legislature, this argument would go on to be used heavily in the abolitionist movement, and real change for the betterment of equality started the same year this plea was published. Abolitionism, the movement to end slavery, started at the end of the 1700s when the condemning of slavery by religious and Christian groups acted as a catalyst for an anti-slavery view becoming more socially acceptable and common in the religiously dominated world. To the abolitionist movement, all people deserved equal rights, especially basic human rights.
With the growing ideas of abolitionism, many enslaved people also tried to stand against slavery by escaping to the north and joining abolitionist or anti-slavery movements and rebellions. One of these rebellions happened in 1800 in Virginia. More than 1,000 enslaved people armed themselves and tried to fight for their freedom. They were forced to disband, and 35 of them, including the leader, were hanged. With growing ideas of equality and moral unrighteousness in the institution of chattel slavery, many people felt repulsed by such practices, and the movement of abolitionism grew. By 1804, the northern states of Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts had all abolished slavery with state-bound legislature. One notable abolitionist was Frederick Douglass. He was born on a plantation but escaped and became free in his early 20s. He would spend his career fighting for the abolition of slavery by advocating for change, oftentimes writing in Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator. He was appointed president of a coalition created by Congress to handle the finances and education of newly released people. His work vastly improved racial equity in the U.S. government, and he was a key member of the abolitionist movement fighting against chattel slavery in the southern states.
In 1854, the Republican Party was founded to be an anti-slavery party focused on freeing enslaved people and making everyone in the United States free to make their own life and succeed. The first Republican to run for office was in 1856, and in 1860, the Republicans first won the White House with Abraham Lincoln as their candidate. With the election of Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War, abolitionist ideas culminated into the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, where the Civil War was defined as a fight against the practice of chattel slavery in order to reclaim the human rights that enslaved people had lost. While the institution of slavery in America was demolished following the Civil War, prejudiced views reinforced by chattel slavery and unjust Jim Crow laws persisted while newly emancipated people scrambled to gain a foothold to live a sustainable life.
Chattel slavery in the colonies and the United States was one of the greatest violations of rights and the misuse of responsibilities that the world had ever seen. Within these brutal conditions, many people had their rights violently taken away from them under the influence of slave owners who ignored the responsibility of their own rights. These slave owners would severely abuse their subjects into submission by emotional torment, torture, and unending labor, as it was a common belief at the time that these people had malicious intentions and worked to overthrow the racial cultural hierarchy by force. Many efforts of slave owners oppressed cultural, societal, and economic rights by physical violence, harsh labor, and emotional threats, as they found it important to quell any demonic influence. These enslaved people grew discontented and sought out any form of rebellion possible, often fleeing into the North where many states had passed laws years earlier outlawing slavery. Sympathy for enslaved people grew as stories about slavery inspired abolitionist movements and prompted the Emancipation Proclamation by Abraham Lincoln in 1863, and consequently the complete eradication of the practice of chattel slavery after the Civil War.
The institution of chattel slavery was completely eradicated after the Civil War. However, its lasting effects continued onward, further imposing restrictions on civil rights through the Jim Crow laws and socially acceptable practices of open racism, combined with segregation at restaurants, water fountains, bathrooms, and more. These contributed to a socio-economic disparity for people of color that still haunts the United States today. The enormous institutions of chattel slavery within America clearly began out of an apathetic economic desire morally justified by a racial, cultural, and religious hierarchy that stole innocent people from their lives, very clearly misusing their rights to assign unjust and immoral responsibilities to other humans.